Our next speaker will be Brenda McDaniel from Kansas State University. She's going to be speaking on structure and consistency of character.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, congratulations. You guys have made it. We're getting right to the end, so hopefully I will keep your attention. I know probably attention spans are waxing and waning right now. But I'm going to talk about a project I'm very, very excited about, so hopefully that enthusiasm will come across to you and will re-energize you for the rest of the session that we have today. So my project is entitled The Structure and Consistency of Character. And like a majority of the projects that you have seen over the past 2 days, I'm going to be spending more time on the structure part rather than the consistency part. We just don't have all the longitudinal data yet to speak to that, so that will be a nice little surprise for you guys next year whenever you come back. So maybe, to get our minds going a little bit, go ahead and take a look at this picture. And I'd like for you to generate what you think may be going on in this picture. So what is happening here? Yeah.
I think a fire truck is coming.
A fire truck is coming.
Like her mom does.
Okay, so maybe protecting the little boy. So this speeding fire truck is coming along, almost a very helpful, maybe moral behavior, saving someone from getting hurt. Any other possible scenarios? Yeah.
Maybe they see Santa Claus, but the girl on the left is afraid of him. And frightening. She's reaching out for somebody to comfort her, and the other girl kind of takes her hand.
Oh, okay, so empathetic, responding.
Or maybe she's being selfish and holding people back.
Yeah, maybe a parade is coming. Candy is being thrown, right? But she wants to dive in and get the candy for herself. So there could be all sorts of things going on with this girl in the blue dress there in terms of what we think of her behavior. And so ultimately, what we all want to do is to be able to describe and explain either these good behaviors or these bad behaviors, and if this is predictive of how individuals will behave later on. So let's say, for example, we'll take that she is saving this little boy's life from the fire truck, or that she's doing this empathetic responding. I know you're excited and I'm excited for you. So maybe because of this behavior, she'll grow up to be a moral exemplar, maybe Mother Teresa, or perhaps if it's this other scenario of maybe a parade with candy coming by and she's shoving the other child out of the way so she can get the rewards, she could become a very strong businesswoman, climbing up to the top, stepping on people. So in terms of our project, we actually have several research questions, and I'm going to highlight the main ones that we have. But as we're going through this talk, you're going to realize that there's actually multiple research questions that could be asked within this data set, which is one thing that makes it so exciting. But the very first question that we're looking at is a developmental question. So we're getting 2 samples of early adolescence, and we're looking at ages 8 to 10, as well as emerging adulthood, 18 to 20 years of age. And one of our first primary goals of the study is to look at Damon's theory of moral integration. And this is very compatible with a lot of moral self, moral identity. If you look at Hart's work, if you look at a variety of other Blasey's work, this is very much compatible with that. It's to where you have this ideal, maybe an ideal self or this concept of morality. So you try to incorporate across time this conception of morality. So the more important it is to you, it becomes a part of the self, a part of the self-concept. And the more important and the more likely it is to be a part of your self-concept, the more likely you're going to behave in that way and actually engage in these moral behaviors. And according to Damon's theory of moral integration, it has a very much developmental timeline, that it takes a process to get there. That in childhood, it's not quite fully integrated yet, and across time, as you go into adolescence, you become more and more integrated. But this developmental model is not something similar to, say, Piaget, to where everyone is going through it, to where everyone's going to get to the same point. Not everyone's going to be Mother Teresa or Gandhi, right? So this happens on varying levels. and I'm going to give you a prelude right now. This is something to come, because right now we just have the emerging adulthood sample. So I'm not going to be giving you any data on this question just yet. Then our second question is looking at social and emotional influences on these behaviors. So specifically role models. And what we're really interested in my lab are ideographic role models. So typically in the role model literature, you may be asked about, what do you think about Gandhi? What are some types of characteristics of Mother Teresa? Or even some type of hypothetical situation of this exemplar student who makes straight A's, who's a scholar athlete. But what we're doing is very much on the individual level, on the ideographic approach, to where each individual is generating their own personal moral role models. So we actually looked at individuals that are personally known, so say family members as well as friends. But we also wanted to look at this distinction in terms of famous individuals, right? So there's always this fear, especially with parents, right, in the media, what is Lindsay Lohan doing? And is my daughter going to do that? Or Britney Spears? Or how LeBron James is acting? So we wanted to see, okay, are those really going to influence what people are doing? So in addition to the different types of role models, the third question that we're looking at is kind of the structure component of character. And what we're doing is we're kind of comparing 3 different ways to look at it. We're taking the traditional personality approach of the Big Five, and you guys have heard a lot about that over the past couple days. But then we're also looking at different types of moral traits. So within there, we have a nomothetic approach. So these are kind of averages on people, what people think are moral, and then an ideographic approach to where each individual generates their own adjectives, disposition, characteristics. So here you have the 10-item personality inventory for the Big Five. So it's your typical extroversion, neuroticism, agreeableness. And then up here, from Aquino and Reed's work on moral identity, we have our nomothetic moral traits. So things like kindness, forgiving, fairness. And then our third category of ideographic traits come from sentence completion tasks. So what we have people do is read through these sentences and generate their own adjectives. So it's important for a good or moral person to be blank and not blank. So these have been completed with a wide variety of responses, sometimes maybe outdoorsy versus homebody. And so that would be almost this behavior, characteristic sort of thing that's not traditionally thought of within the Big Five, or even within these nomothetic moral traits that I just showed you. So this is a nice little way to capture what else might be going on. And we do have previous literature to suggest that this ideographic approach does help explain personality beyond the Big Five to a substantial proportion. So whenever you're coming into the lab, this is what we're having people do. We're having them rate themselves and different role models on these 3 areas, the Big Five, the nomothetic moral traits, as well as the ideographic, on a 5-point scale. So you strongly agree or strongly disagree whether or not you are this type of person. And then lastly, we have this question of consistency, which again, this is going to be a prelude to next time. So a nice little trailer for you. Looking at the consistency in terms of both early adolescence and emerging adulthood, comparing within these 3 different types of structures, possibly for personality, and even more specifically, right, for character. And what we're doing beyond that is doing the experience sampling. So actually seeing, okay, are there density distributions going on here in terms of explaining that variability? And does it matter in terms of the actual structure that we're using? So we can compare that. So we actually have 2 different age samples, and they are completing these different types of traits, respectively, 2 times for the adolescents, the early adolescents, and then 4 times for the emerging adults. And they're doing that same thing for the experience sampling. So we've got a longitudinal experience sampling as well as kind of these average traits going on. So what they do is they fill out surveys 4 times a day for 5 days. And what's very exciting about this, of course, I say all this is exciting, right? But one of the things that's very exciting about this aspect of the study is that we ask them about these role models, these personal role models. Have they interacted with them? Have they talked to them on Facebook? Have they called them recently? We ask them about their behavior. How much did your mother impact you to do that behavior? So it's not only are we kind of up here with the correlations, we can actually see through the experience sampling maybe a little bit more of a causal inference in terms of influence of these role models. So those were all 4 of the questions, and there's definitely more that could be derived from this data set. But what we're going to focus on today is about 1.5 of those questions. So the first one, we're going to look at these different types of role models, both positive and negative, some that are personally known as well as famous. And then we're going to look at these 2 different types of structures. So the ideographic stuff is not here yet, takes a little bit longer to code. But we're going to compare at least the big 5 and the nomothetic moral traits today. So all of this work is actually based in George Kelly's theory of personality, of personal constructs, which is that not necessarily a mainstream theory of personality, but I can definitely talk to you more about Kelly's theory, but that almost is a talk in and of itself. But one of the ways that he helps to capture these personal constructs that people have is through a technique called the Repertory Grid. And the Repertory Grid, it sounds kind of scary or sterile maybe, but all it is you're going in and you're generating people that you know, rating them, and rating yourself, and maybe even your ideal self. And we can get this nice little constellation going on of what's going on in your social world. So within our repertory grids, we actually have different types of good or moral role models, a family member that you look up to or try to be like, so we have that kind of emulation component, that desire, that motivation, a good or moral friend that you look up to or try to be like, as well as a teacher, coach, preacher, or some other adult outside of your family that you look up to, and a famous person. In the same token, we have the reverse of those. So, a bad or immoral family member that you do not want to be like. So whenever you get to kind of the negative ones, people immediately, they're like, oh, Uncle Joe, I know exactly what to write down there. So we're kind of wondering, is like, say, running with a bad crowd or being from a bad family, how much that actually is influential, or if maybe these more positive role models, or maybe they're equally influential. So this is a lovely, beautiful graphic that we can get out of our computer program, and it gives you a nice little semantic space of what's going on. So you can see down here, that is the actual self. So that's how this individual views themselves. So they kind of see themselves as not so honest, as telling lies, but maybe a little bit fair, a little quiet. And up here you can see they think Britney Spears is anxious, extroverted, and unfair. As well as, here's a possible teacher over here, along with the ideal self and mom, who are conventional and dependable. So with this, you can actually do some really cool analyses to get at this entire semantic space going on, this social picture. But today, I'm just going to show you dyadic relationships in between the self and a specific role model. And this is a preview of things to come, right? Keep you interested in coming back.
Just a quick question of clarification. Is this a circumflex model? Is it like a y-axis and an x-axis and these are?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and the y-axis is?
It's basically to where you can run a principal component analysis, and you get like 2 components to where you're going to have people clustering as well as traits clustering.
What are they in this?
Oh, well, this is fictitious. So this probably will not make any sense looking at it. So this isn't a real grid.
That's fine.
So-
I was just a little confused. I was trying to figure out what the.
No, I actually,
Who's unfair and
yeah. You're like, I don't understand, that doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
And it's because it doesn't.
Okay, good to know.
What I did is I took a grid and I changed the traits that were on there, so. But I'll give you a real grid next time.
You'll have a two-dimensional representation, like two axes, is that the
Mhm, mhm. Okay, so I talked about the dyadic relationship that we're going to talk about. And we're looking at moral integration. So the way that we're looking at that is almost this idealized state. So what do you desire, hope, want to be like? This absolute standard of morality going on. And we're seeing where the person is at relative to that standard. So this nice little discrepancy. So theoretically, the closer you are to that ideal, the more integrated you would be, because those traits would be more important to yourself. You would be reporting higher levels of those traits. So in terms of looking at actual outcomes, maybe behaviors, in terms of moral integration, we've got some previous work that does show individuals like moral rebels. If you guys are familiar with moral rebels, people who stand up against the crowd, so we talked about Milgram, so those individuals who are not conforming, that they actually have higher, significantly higher levels of moral trait integration. And so what we're looking at here, okay, well, does that integration predict other possible outcomes or behaviors? And in what we have so far, looking at the VIA, and we've got some of those traits up here: hope, optimism, humor, perseverance, as well as leadership. And what I'm doing here is I'm comparing the relationships between the moral trait integration on those nomothetic traits to integration on the big five traits. So it's almost to where you're getting an idealized concept. So if you're reporting that you'd like to be more conscientious, more emotionally stable, typically those are all scored in the same direction. Most of the time people don't report that they want to become more neurotic. But you always get that occasional participant coming in saying that. But whenever you're getting closer and closer to your ideal, that you're incorporating that into your self-concept, we can see that does play out into behaviors that you're reporting. So that you're more likely to be hopeful, humorous, persevere, and follow leadership roles if you're doing better on those moral traits that I presented. So not telling lies, being fair, and the same goes here for these big five traits.
Are those negative though? Wait, so
Yeah,
they're not
that's an
integrated
excellent
or-
question.
Well,
I was about ready to
Well,
say
they
it.
are negative, I don't know.
They are negative, and that is correct. Those negatives should be there.
Okay, so the more integrated you are, the less optimistic you are? Is that the right way to interpret that?
No, not quite. Okay, so if you're thinking about a discrepancy, right? So here's the self, and here I really want to be very, very honest. So the smaller the discrepancy is, the more likely you are to be hopeful, the more likely you are to be optimistic. So it goes smaller to large. Or vice versa, let's say if you were low on humor, that means you're going to be a bigger discrepancy between that absolute ideal.
Okay, it says integration, so but you're saying it's discrepancy. It's okay. Anyway, I don't do it.
No, that's fine. Yes, I may be confusing because I'm kind of using those two things interchangeably. I'm using the discrepancy mathematically to represent integration theoretically.
Okay, now I got it. I'm good.
Oh, okay.
People who are more integrated are more humorous and playful.
Yep.
Is that the idea?
So the closer you are to that ideal, the more likely that you're displaying these virtuous characteristics. And so right now, when we compare these two, in terms of magnitude, significance, they all kind of, look pretty much the same if we're trying to figure out which structure that we want to choose that would be more important to us. But, of course, that's not the full story, right? So if we continue on with some other VIA, some other virtues, You can see here, there's a much different picture going on. So is there anything that jumps out here?
These dimensions aren't represented in the big five?
Yeah, to where there's something about those nomothetic moral traits that are distinct, that are picking up unique variants. So basically the big five does help us, but it's not telling the full story of what's going on, that there's more characteristics that we're not necessarily capturing. But here you can see gratitude, modesty, wisdom, and self-regulation are related to greater levels of moral trait integration, but not to the big five. Okay, so moving beyond maybe just VIA, some other possible outcomes you could look at. Looking at the strengths and difficulty questionnaire, if you look at conduct problems, peer problems, pro-social behavior is often used, right, in the moral literature. So if you're more morally integrated, are you more likely to be high and low on these concepts here, on these behaviors? And you can see there's kind of this mixed bag picture going on, at least from our preliminary data, to where the moral trait integration, it is significant with conduct problems, so things like stealing, cheating, lying, as well as pro-social behavior, so helping others, volunteering, sharing. But there's a little bit of a different picture with peer problems. So that's kind of like getting into fights, being aggressive. So it could very well be the case that these two different structures are maybe related to or predictive of different behaviors. So perhaps the big five traits are more interpersonally oriented to where it would pick up more on peer problems rather than, say, conduct problems, which are much more kind of solid in terms of the law, moral value, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't steal, and pro-social behavior, the flip of that. I have quizzical looks. Does anyone? Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand this integration score. So could it be the case that a kid, for example, says, I'm not very honest, but I don't aspire to be all that honest. So they would have a low integration score. So it's not where they stand overall. It's you could have a low integration score because your aspirational ideals are really low.
The way that we have done this, we've actually looked at it both ways, looking at how they're reporting their ideal self as well as this absolute end of the scale ideal, and they're actually very highly correlated. And so what I've shown you here is that absolute moral standard idea of saying, just theoretically that it would be best to be this honest, this fair, that sort of thing. And so what we're looking at is kind of the absolute.
Right. So it sounds like what the aspirational levels are probably fairly similar across individuals, and what differs is where they actually stand with respect to those aspirations.
Absolutely, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Okay. So that tricky moral integration stuff. So using still that same idea, that discrepancy going on, looking at role models. So I talked about that before, right? So in terms of the big five, if you're looking out at your group of people that are your role models, your family members, your friends, are they extremely high on conscientiousness? Are they extremely extroverted? These more kind of desirable things. Is that related to how you are? So basically, it's this idea if they are influencing each other, and likely, since we're looking at more youth, that these role models would be influencing the youth. So we're seeing if they're predictive. So when looking at the big five, it doesn't really seem to appear that there's a whole lot of relationship with these role models. So out of those positive role models, only a positive family member and a positive teacher was predictive of the participants' level of moral integration. And there was absolutely no effect for negative role models, so unrelated. And I'll tell you maybe why here in just a second, but I'll show you the reverse side of that in terms of the results on the nomothetic traits. So here we actually see a wide variety of role models having an influence, to where if an individual has a positive family member, a positive friend, positive teacher that is more morally integrated, closer to that ideal, that they are actually more likely to be closer to that ideal themselves. So it seems to be the case here that you get a wider span of role models exhibiting a possible influence on the self, as well as you use negative examples of what not to be. That you actually see those individuals and there's a negative beta weight telling you that I definitely know how this person is and I strive not to be like that person. But if you notice from kind of these multiple R squares that there's a stronger effect for the positive role models. So this idea of being inspirational, striving to be like that person is much more motivating than trying to not become Uncle Joe or Aunt Susie, kind of pushing that more negative behavior away. But it could be the case, and I told you just a moment ago in terms of the big five, that we're looking at emerging adulthood. So maybe it's the case that some of those traits are not as malleable at that point, and that these are much more in flux, especially with Damon's theory in terms of how those traits interact with the self. So it'll be very interesting to see whenever we get that younger age sample if those are actually different or similar. So it could be the case that we have more role models influencing the big five traits. So what is my take-home message, just based off of this preliminary data, is that perhaps the structure of the big five is not our full story, that we do need to search elsewhere and include these other structures to help us describe character and moral behavior. As well as this idea of positive versus negative role models, that we seem to definitely have this fear of the negative or the bad crowd, running with the bad crowd, dragging us down, and that doesn't seem to be as impactful as what this inspirational component is of desiring to be like. And it's not LeBron James or anyone else who is necessarily a huge influence on your behavior. That it's much more likely that your mom or your stepdad or your best friend Sally is more influential on your character development or moral behavior. So, any parents in the room, you can, it's relief with all those media influences out there. So in terms of future directions, I'm just going to remind you of some of the questions that I started off with that we'll talk about next year. So we're going to have another H sample to be able to present in addition to this experience sampling data to see how this consistency is actually working, these longitudinal waves, and looking at age differences and moral trait integration, as well as, this is kind of an interesting one as well, role models influence across time. So if you actually see that desire to be like that person, is the person actually changing more like that person? Or is it more of this static thing to where somehow you're not transitioning into that position? And what's kind of interesting about this, I think I started to tell you, but I may have stopped whenever we were talking about the moral rebels, the people who stand up for their behavior. They actually have better role models too, significantly better role models. So perhaps in terms of looking at interventions or how do we cultivate character, programs like Boys and Girls Club, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, in terms of getting those more positive role models, definitely kind of supports what we've seen here in the data. And it will be exciting next time to talk about these more idiographic traits on an individual level and see how those are actually comparing. But based off of previous work, I do expect those idiographic traits to actually make up their own unique percentage of variance in terms of explaining behavior and personality. So that should be exciting to see. And I would like to thank Wake Forest University, the Character Project, as well as the John Templeton Foundation for funding for this project. And I will take any questions that you guys have.
Can you keep your hands up briefly so I can?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I just have a couple of questions, and I suppose that my first one is about the extent to which these familiar role models from people's lives themselves incorporate both positive and negative traits. And in terms of the moral development, I'm not very familiar with Damon's theory, but in terms of the moral development of the child, you know, as he or she moves forward, it would seem to me that there would be significant differences in appraisal as the child develops both cognitively and emotionally. That at a certain level, they're really just going to want to be like mom or dad, no matter what. You know, and at the higher level, they will pick out qualities of mom and dad that they don't want to emulate or imitate, or don't want to have. And so that's kind of one set of questions about the nuance, and I would expect you to find that in your idiographic data. The second is just the observation that I think in terms of imitating a role model, that answers part of the question about virtue development, but not the whole question. Because you can imagine somebody being stuck sort of at a certain age where, you want to be like your dad because your dad is a just person, but you don't want to be just for its own sake. So if your dad was not just, you wouldn't care about justice. Right? You just want to be like your dad. So those are sort of some...
Yeah, so going back to maybe the first point, in terms of youth, and we have done this with a little bit younger ages, so even 7- and 6-year-olds, and you do get that to where it's very much this kind of global assessment that someone is all good or someone is all bad, and it's very hard to differentiate, or we haven't figured out a way to actually collect it to make that meaningful. Once you get up into about 8 or 10, you do see more variation going on. And where we're getting this youth sample from, they're from area boys and girls clubs, and traditionally those are historically located in lower SES neighborhoods. And we're collecting from a couple of Indian reservations as well as predominantly African American populations. And you do actually see populations like that who have gone through adversity more likely to report or see those negative characteristics in even their parents. So those are some of the things that at least we've seen, and you'll have to maybe cue me about the second.
Well, the second one again is, does the subject reach an age at which they become kind of stuck? And they just want to be just because their dad is just, but they don't want to become just because they value justice. Because it seems to me that there's an important part of a developmental trajectory in terms of developing true virtue, that you stop wanting to be like somebody because you like that person, and you start wanting to have that trait because you value the trait. And that would seem to me to be more likely to come up somewhere in the emerging adulthood age, that they make that kind of transition.
Right. So would you expect in that situation, if they're not valuing justice for justice's sake, that other role models who are exhibiting that justice trait would not be as impactful as, say, the dad role model, which is really the role model that you're wanting to get at? Yeah. So we could actually look at that to see, to look at these different types of roles people play and see, if it really is overall this trait that may be doing it, or it could very well be the case that, I just want to be like my dad, and my dad is just.
I think that would be a really interesting thing to look at.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good point.
Jessica?
I really enjoyed your talk, but I'm still a little confused about the integration piece. I guess what I'm wondering is what it sort of buys you. So if there's not a lot of variability in terms of what kids are aspiring to, but really the variability is driven by where they're actually scoring, why not just look at that relationship? What does it buy you over and above just looking at absolute scores?
Right. So maybe just taking their scoring a 1 and seeing how that's related versus taking this discrepancy between the 1 and the 2. And you're right, as you go down, lower and lower in age, you're not getting as much variability as what you're getting out of the emerging adulthood sample. Fortunately, we have found with the 8 to 10-year-olds that they're definitely not using the range of the scale that you see in adulthood, but there is definitely more variation going on. And so it seems that we're actually kind of gaining possibly a better picture of how close or how far away they are to that ideal. And perhaps it could also be my own bias in terms of my previous work looking at how discrepancies, self-discrepancies, are related to various psychological states and that sort of thing. But there is definitely that argument in the literature of why do a discrepancy? You know, just take the actual self where it's at and that's all you need.
But in your sample empirically, is it true that if you look at discrepancy scores versus raw scores, that it accounts for more of the variance? Or do you not really know?
That is an excellent question. In our previous studies, I'll have to look at it actually with this data, but in our previous studies it has been the case that that integration is doing better than just the actual score. So I guess in some sense it is buying us something, but it's not a huge percentage of the variance. You could still get, you know, a rough estimate or a picture of just using the self-score.
I was wondering, when you were talking about your role models, the virtuous role models were always sort of liked and admired, and the non-virtuous role models were always disliked. And I had a student once who did a little bit of pilot data where we saw whether they'd be more inspired by a powerful virtuous other like Barack Obama or a subservient model like Mother Teresa. And we found that disagreeable people were actually really demotivated by thinking about Mother Teresa. They really needed a powerful virtuous. And I can think of role model, I can think of people in my life and I think that person's really virtuous and I would never want to be like that. Right? I mean, is there any interaction that you can, in your ideographic data, is there any way to sort of get at what it is that they're admiring about these role models and could that interact with personality in some way that, that you could capture?
Oh, absolutely. I think you're touching on a very important concept to where what we could do is have them complete the grids and then perhaps do some type of diary study or dialogue with them to where they're explaining or describing why they chose that person. So, you know, one individual choosing Mother Teresa could have a completely different motivation than someone else choosing Mother Teresa. So at least right now, within the framework of George Kelly's theory of personality, you typically nominate individuals that are important to you and to the self and in terms of self-development. So in terms of that question about maybe not having the same meaning, we know at least on the individual level that's important to you, regardless of who you nominate, but that extra question is very nice in terms of the why. Yeah.
Mike?
So that's related to my question, because I wonder if the impact of negative role models is actually higher if the concept of a role model the kid brings is someone that we might say is negative according to my understanding. If that makes sense. And I might have just missed how, if you try to direct that, what's their definition of positive and negative when they come to this stuff?
Right. So you're kind of wondering about, well, wait a minute, I think these negative role models do actually impact much more than maybe what this data is describing right now.
Maybe, yeah, possibly, but just because I'm wondering, I guess it's more this philosophical question, what conception of positive and negative? So someone might think Donald Trump's my role model, and someone might think Mother Teresa is, and might think something.
Yeah. And I think the reason why I have adopted Kelly's theory of personality is because it does work on that ideographic level on the individual. So it's not to where I necessarily have to worry about this average to make sure that everyone's kind of selecting things exactly the same. I just prompt them, and according to Kelly, what's going to be salient for you is what's going to come up. So whenever I say to you, immoral, bad role model, and so what that means to you is the most important thing. It doesn't necessarily matter if the person sitting next to you has that same definition of immoral or bad. It's just how you're conceptualizing it and how it impacts you.
Okay, so then I get worried as a parent, because what if my kids have different role models, and of course I'm right because I'm their dad. All right, anyway, that makes sense. Okay, thanks.
Man, I thought I was leaving you with comfort as a parent.
Those all done?
Well, I'd like to piggyback on that a little bit because I've had the same kind of question about negative role models. I understand the questions that you were having people ask in the questionnaire indicated that an example of an immoral person would be someone that I don't want to be like. But I don't know if it really gets at the question of people who admire other people who might not be worthy of being admired from a third-party perspective. So I don't know if...
Sure, so almost like this third category, something that's not represented up here in terms of good or bad, someone who still you want to be like, but
it's a questionable role model. And I'm not positive that the way that the questions were asked initially, like someone I wouldn't want to be like my Uncle Joe who is bad. But I do think that there is this other, especially with children, this other possibility that they could admire a friend who seems powerful but who is mean to people, and it wouldn't have anything to do with morality, the admiration. So there is this role model, but it could have a negative formative impact.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. I have thought about that before. So in terms of phrasing it or trying to elicit that role model, do you have any ideas in terms of how to capture that?
I don't know in terms of how this would apply to psychology scales. I think starting with the question of who are your role models and what attributes do you admire in them or something like that. Maybe a starting point.
Yeah, one way I have thought about possibly addressing that with the data that I do have is looking at almost consistency across various moral traits. So being honest, being fair, having multiple components, seeing if that is, you can look at the positive versus the negative role models. And we've seen in our previous data that the positive role models are more consistently good or virtuous across multiple moral traits. As well as the negative role models are less consistent, so maybe sometimes they lie, sometimes they're honest, or sometimes they're fair, sometimes they're not. But it's still not quite getting at that other area. But at least right now with this data, we know that they're nominating positive people and negative people, but there's kind of that gray area of someone that I'd like to be like, but maybe they're not so great to be like.
We have time for one last question. Or maybe we should end it there.